So hi everyone, my name's Tom and today I'm going to be taking you through the personal statement that got me into the University of Cambridge. I know the UCAS application deadline is right around the corner, and with that there is obviously a deadline to finish your personal statements. Some of you may have already done so, but for those that haven't, whether you're in the latter stages and you just need something of a review tool, or whether you are in the earlier stages and you still need a bit of a kickstart, hopefully this video will be of use to you. A little bit about myself. I've just graduated from the University of Cambridge with a degree in history and politics. Spent 3 years at Trinity College. I'm now about to start graduate study at the University of Chicago in the States. So just a little overview of kind of how this video is going to pan out. I'm going to start off with just a little bit of context. I think this is really important, just so you get an idea of what I was doing at the time, kind of where my head was. And I think this is something that a lot of videos of this ilk often tend to neglect. I mean, especially now. I wrote this when I was 17. I'm now 21. And it wouldn't be fair to kind of come back and critique my own statement if I didn't at least give a little bit of context to it. Next, I'll just briefly be going over a bit of general structure, how I laid out my personal statement, kind of what the main components are. And then kind of the majority of this video will be spent on paragraph specifics. So kind of the content in my paragraphs as well as the layout within them. So just returning to that context, at the time when I was writing my statement, I was doing 3 A levels, history, maths and Spanish, and obviously a bit of variation. We'll kind of come on to that in a second. And as you'll notice, and perhaps more presciently, across my 5 university applications, there is obviously a lot of variation there as well. Now I don't want all those names to alarm you. It looks a lot more complicated than it is. What I want you to know is essentially I applied for history and politics at Cambridge, and then what is essentially politics and Spanish elsewhere. Now this is important because I assume a lot of you are going to be now in the same boat that I was back then, in that you're applying for one thing at Cambridge and then something else at a lot of other universities. For politics students especially, I know this is probably fairly prevalent given that there isn't any straight politics course at either Oxford or Cambridge. You're probably either looking at history and politics or HSBS at Cambridge, or history and politics and perhaps PPE at Oxford. So hopefully the fact that I was in a similar scenario will maybe make this video resonate with you a bit more. And obviously just as well, the fact that I was kind of having to combine history, politics and Spanish will kind of give a bit of context as to why my personal statement was the way that it was. So just a bit about general structure. Hopefully you can see on your screen. I kind of had 3 main components to my personal statement. In yellow, we have the introduction. Not everyone has one. You don't have to have one. For me, I just think it's a better way into the personal statement. A lot of personal statements that I read that kind of go straight in feel a bit clunky. It kind of feels like there's something missing without a bit of preamble. For me, as a joint honours student, I think an introduction is pretty key. I think as a joint honours student, so one of the first things you have to do in your personal statement is address the fact that you are applying for a joint honours course, and so you have to explain to the admissions tutor why it is not only that you're applying for these 2 subjects, but what it is, or what are the links that you see between these 2 subjects. I think that's pretty crucial. Then next we have in the blue the 3 main body paragraphs. I was actually talking to my younger brother who's just started year 13, read through his personal statement. Had some very good stuff, talking about very good things, lots of very good examples. His main problem was that he just lacked depth. He was kind of skirting over topics, he was jumping back and forth between them, and he wasn't really getting much out of what were very good opportunities. And so kind of my main advice, what I did here and what I would continue to advocate for, is kind of having 3 to 5 meaty main body paragraphs where you focus on 3 to 5 kind of core ideas, debates, topics, whatever it is. You'll get a lot more out of them if you do it this way, I think. And I think the personal statement will flow a lot better. And finally, just at the bottom, we have this green, this kind of concluding paragraph. Again, you don't have to have this. You can probably round it off in that final paragraph potentially. For mine, as you might be able to read, or as we'll see later anyway, mine just has a little bit about extracurriculars. We'll come on to that. I know that's a bit of a contentious topic. And then just what is essentially a kind of a finalizing, concluding, rounding off sort of sentence. Just to give, just to bring it all together at the end, and we'll come to each of these in turn. So paragraph specifics. Obviously going to start off with the introduction. As I said, the main thing here, as a joint honours student especially, is addressing that joint honours aspect straight away. For me, it was making this parallel here. You can read through it now. This quote from this Francoist official, has quite a lot of resemblance to this quote by Michael Gove much more recently. And I think it was just a very good way of kind of linking history and politics, and also I think it's a very good way of, at least in this case, I thought of putting the reader in not only a quote but a quote in Spanish. Obviously, for me, that helped with the Spanish kind of aspect of my application. In terms of the quote, because I know people are going to ask about that, my first point would be to say is don't go looking for a quote. Don't put one in just because you want one. There are other ways to kind of address or kind of interest the admission student straight away. You might have a personal experience, talk about current events. That's something that's always easy and works very well. And for politics students, it's something that you will have to do within the personal statement. For me, I guess I got a little bit lucky. I was reading a book that is actually mentioned later on in this statement. I found this quote and made the connection, and it just so happened that I was kind of able to address history, politics, and Spanish within this introduction. So, kind of my first main body paragraph. What I want to talk about here is kind of the concept of interest. Now, hopefully by now you've kind of realized the purpose of a personal statement is to demonstrate your interest for a subject and for a course. Not just that you have, I guess, the requisite knowledge, but also that you have the passion and the desire for that subject. And I think the way to do this, as I've done here, and I still believe is the correct way to do it, is this tripartite structure. So the first point is just to identify the interest. It's fairly straightforward. And the second part is just give examples of that, whether that's any books you've read, any videos you've watched, courses you've done, talks you've been to, things like that. 90% of personal statements should and do have this. However, what I think will take your personal statement to the next level, especially for Oxbridge admissions, is the third point, which is what I'm going to call application of interest. And this is where I guess you show that you've actually been properly engaging in the stuff that you've been digesting, and that you actually got something out of it. So this can come in the form of kind of any conclusions you want to draw, any kind of viewpoints you want to give, maybe you want to make some new connections. Again, you could link stuff to current events. That's just always something you can go back to. So in this example, what I have, the interest is kind of, Middle Eastern history and politics, and I guess more specifically, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You then have the examples, so this debate, which I would very much recommend. You then have this book, which in hindsight, I would less so recommend for anyone interested in these same kind of subjects. What we then have is this application of interest sentence. So my independent research project led me to conclude that British and UN mismanagement were initial driving factors in the ongoing struggle. And so what I've done here is I've given my own kind of judgment on topic, my own conclusion, and this is something that is absolutely key for Oxbridge admissions, and particularly for humanities, things like history and politics, where you are going to be expected to weigh in on topics. Now, following on from that, as you may have deduced now, this is from an independent research project, specifically my history A-level. And what I will say is that I think some people are often afraid to use their schoolwork, perhaps because they want to kind of stand out. They don't want to seem to be doing the things that everyone else is doing. But stuff like IRPs, EPQs, I think are a great way to, or a great thing to include. They're probably going to be the most extended, potentially the most advanced things that you've done up to that point. And for me, at least, having done 3 years of undergrad, my A-level IRP was the piece of schoolwork that most closely resembled academic work, at least in the sense of historiography, the way you engage with sources and the way you write and so forth. And here, if you can, especially for history students, if you can get involved in the historiography, if you can reference authors like that, that's all the better. And just finally on this paragraph, I just want to talk about this latter stage of the paragraph. You might notice that I kind of shift to talk about international organizations. That's completely fine. If you have good examples, you want to get as many of them as possible. What I want to say quickly is how I think you should go about doing this. What you don't want to be doing is kind of cramming in loads of different things. You don't want to start to feel just disjointed. I mean, in this scenario, you probably could have made a new paragraph. What I like to use, because I think it gives more flow, and particularly if you can do it, is to make connections. So it's a fairly brief connection, but I just think it makes the paragraph flow better. I've used I guess the UN as a pivot point to go from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or the Arab-Israeli conflict as it was at the time, to kind of talking about international organizations, the liberal world order, and so forth. And I just think it's something to bear in mind if you're if you want your personal statement to flow better, and also just if you want to kind of show that you're thinking about the connections between things and therefore about the connections between history and politics. And again, you see here in this little discussion on international organizations that I still have that tripartite structure. So I've identified the interests, so international organizations, got those examples, so the two talks there, and then I have kind of my own thoughts on the matter. Now I want to talk about this paragraph, mainly because it actually shows it's actually a rather poor example, I think, of the tripartite structure, and I guess my first self-critique. So you'll see if you read this that I identify it fairly well. We're obviously talking about American kind of political history and American politics, populism, that sort of thing. If you then kind of go further down, I've got that application of interest. So I'm talking about the Republican Party, mainstream media, and just kind of giving my own thoughts on that. The problem with this, though, is that it's lacking in examples. So if you see here, the only example that I give is the Cambridge Festival of Ideas, and it's not a bad example in of itself. The problem is it's a future example, right? It's something I haven't been to yet. And it's not intrinsically bad, but it is, in my opinion, far better to be using past examples, so things you've already done. You're going to have a lot more to talk about, and it's not going to feel like you're kind of using it as a filler, which I think in this case I probably was. I don't think I probably had something to talk about in that scenario. The best thing to have done would have been literally to have watched a YouTube video, not even have to read a book. You can just read an article, and that would honestly just be 15-20 minute YouTube video, kind of 20-page article, and I think it would have been a genuinely better example than that. Having said that, what I do like about this paragraph is that I do manage to recover it at the end, and kind of go back to that application of interest. So if you see in this last paragraph, I don't provide my own viewpoint so much as what I do is I make kind of new connections. So you see I reference this book and kind of the conclusions that the author of that book draws, and I link it back to what I've been talking about prior about American politics and American populism. And so you don't have to, give these completely original viewpoints. You can just make new connections instead, and that is something that's going to be equally valuable to admissions tutors. Now this paragraph does much the same. For me, it's kind of an expansion of the introduction in the sense that if you read it, it kind of collates again history, politics, and Spanish. I mean, I think you'll agree as you've been following me, that what I've tried to do is synthesize history and politics throughout the paragraphs. You don't have to do it exactly like that. You might choose to kind of have a couple of paragraphs each on history and politics, and then kind of one paragraph where you kind of properly synthesize them together. As long as you kind of, do a decent amount and are very direct with it, then that's no problem. For me, obviously, I wanted as well to get that Spanish element in, and so this paragraph for me is all about kind of combining the history, politics, and Spanish, and it's potentially something that some of you guys are going to have to grapple with or are grappling with now as well. And again, this is perhaps the clearest example I have of that tripartite structure. So we've got the identification of the interests, so kind of Spanish politics, ideological battles, that sort of thing. Then I've got my examples, the documentary, and these discussions, and then I have kind of my application of interest, so my own thoughts, and specifically a link to current events, which I think in any personal statement is key, and particularly for politics, is kind of something you probably need to be doing 2, 3, 4 times throughout a statement, just to show that you are still kind of engaging in up-to-date news. And I guess just the last thing with this paragraph, because it's probably something you've noticed, is just this little kind of sentence about Russian on the end. The reason I did this is because I believe with my Durham application, I had kind of the opportunity to take an extra module in Russian. So this is where this came from. The only thing I would say about this is that obviously it's a little bit different to the rest of the paragraph. However, again, what I've tried to do is I've tried to at least find that connection so there's a bit more flow. In this case, obviously I've been talking a little bit about Spanish language, and so there was just kind of a little connection there for the Russian. The only other thing I would say is where the connection is tenuous, or where you're kind of talking about potentially two different things, is just keep it short as I've done here. No point kind of waffling or saying more than you need to, just quickly introducing the Russian, because I think it's a very good example to have in a personal statement. It shows a lot of different skills, a lot of different things, but just keep it to a minimum, especially if there isn't much to talk about. The mission shoot's going to see a mile off if you're kind of stretching an example, and if it doesn't really fit with everything else, it's better just to keep it brief. So finally, just want to go to that kind of concluding paragraph. So the main thing we're going to talk about here is extracurriculars, because obviously there's a bit of debate. The main thing I would just say is don't include them for the sake of it. Only include them if you're actually going to if you've got relevant transferable skills out of them. So actually, that Russian was actually something I did for DAV. DAV is actually obviously something that is brought up a lot, but that was actually something I did for DAV and was something that is definitely worth including. Language study, kind of any kind of if you're learning coding, anything like that, it's very, very useful to put in. As you can see, I kind of got a couple of things about kind of communication and judgments. I think this world challenge one is just a little bit interesting, kind of talking about data sets for a couple of reasons. One, I guess just because I wanted to link back to my A-level maths. I'm not saying that you kind of have to justify your A-level choice within your personal statement, but I think if possible, especially if you're doing a variety of things, it's nice to kind of at least acknowledge that variety, show that you are kind of, that you do take, I guess, a holistic approach to education. Also, for anyone who's kind of looked through politics courses at universities, especially, will know that there's a lot more data-driven stuff now, and there's plenty of kind of data-driven modules that you can take, and so kind of any doors that you can open for yourself in your personal statement, you should absolutely do so. And the final thing to cover is just this kind of last sentence. Now, for me, I've known for a long time what I wanted to go into, as you can see here, kind of international security and diplomacy, and so for me, kind of, it made a lot of sense to round off my personal statement kind of just with a brief kind of discussion, not even a discussion, just a brief statement of kind of where I want to go after university. One, because I just think it gives kind of a background to your interests and kind of almost a justification, and just rounds them off. Obviously, under no circumstances do you have to know what you want to do after university, and so some of you may not be able to or may not want to kind of reference the future. There's plenty of other ways to round it off. You could honestly just summarize your personal statement, maybe summarize the interests that you've had, maybe summarize again kind of where your interests come from, so your background, your inspiration, and really just, it's nothing more than kind of a concluding sentence to kind of reiterate your interest for that subject, and just make sure that your personal statement kind of doesn't end in a kind of a clunky, kind of ungainly manner. So hopefully that's been very instructive. I have here just kind of, I guess, my three main points that I'd like to reiterate, because I think these are kind of the three kind of key things to take from this, hopefully. First one is, as it says here, thick, not thin examples. Make sure, quality over quantity, essentially. 3 to 5 examples that you really develop and that you really kind of get a lot out. Don't skim over stuff. Don't kind of try not to briefly mention stuff. Don't scratch the surface. Be 3 to 5 good, strong examples. Next is just that interest application structure that I've talked about. Not simply detailing the interest and showing your examples, but applying that interest. What have you learned from it? What would you potentially like to learn from it more? What are your thoughts on it? That kind of thing. And finally, just I guess kind of more specific to what I did, and hopefully kind of relevant to a lot of you, is just that joint honours aspect. If you're applying for joint honours courses at Oxbridge, you've got to be able to address head on, essentially, that joint honours aspect. Why are you studying those two subjects? Why are you studying them together? What are the links between them? So those are my kind of final 3 concluding remarks, and hopefully this video has been very helpful for you.